Hey, good morning. Uh, a new location for you this morning. I have decided that today, since I want to spend a little bit of energy, uh, not necessarily in a sort of a spiritual focus today, but in a kind of a reflective thought piece, particularly as we are all wrestling internally or trying to wrap our souls and our bodies and our minds around uh, sort of the energy in our culture right now around systemic racism and the Black Lives Matter movement. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time on that today and just give you some of my insights into sort of what's been churning for me. And then I'm not quite sure how to invite you to share yours, but I want to hear from you as well about what's happening for you in around that space as well. So I'll let you get settled in, and glad to see people logging on this morning. I'm in my office today at church, so a comfy little space with all. I got Martin Luther behind me, and my cocktail glass, some poetry, memorabilia, and of course, a lot of books that have been a part of my journey up to this point. So it's a always a very comfy space for me to be in. I'm glad that you're here with me today. Um, I wanted to start with just some brief reflections as you shout out to one another and acknowledge that you're present and shoot up some emoticons for the day to kind of get us started. Um, I think I've had a kind of a mini revelation in this during this pandemic and having to be forced out of having to leave the kind of standard way in which we construct a Sunday morning. And that standard way for every year, 365 days of the year, all 52 weeks, is been based on a liturgical cycle of the church year. And so we're driven by the content of our theology and our biblical stories. And that drives what we talk about or how our focus is centered every Sunday morning. And so to get ready for those weeks, I get together with all my books and my and the resources I have that connect us to this cycle, this liturgical cycle of readings and hymnody and kind of liturgical energy, and then try to make some connection between that and the world. But we start here. We start with the church year content, and we try to apply it to the world. And because now we've been disconnected from that, we've had to leave that behind and spend a little bit of time on a Sunday morning in a different way. The whole process has been reversed. And that's kind of the revelation that I've sort of had that's been so impressive, I think, for me, is that we're now going the other direction, right? You and I are so focused in on world, particularly me as I get ready for Sunday morning. I'm so focused in on world that it's world that and the situation that we're actually in, the experience we're having of life, that is now where I begin. And then I work my way back to what is there something in our tradition, something in the religious experience that can be in conversation with the world. And that has changed the way in which I think about my Sunday experience. And I'm, be frank, for those of you who attend this church, I'm not sure I'll ever go back. I'm finding this to be way more dynamic in its capacity to energize and engage not only our faith tradition but the whole religious journey in conversation with the vibrancy of what's happening in the world, whether that be good stuff or bad stuff. So a little bit of a revelation. A little side note before we get started is I used to take a journal called, and it's still published to this day, I think, called Word and World. Word and World. And the implication, of course, was that the Word was the Scripture, and then the Scripture would be applied to the world. And so my little contribution to the revelation that I have had is that I think those two need to be reversed, right? It is world that tries to find, it is world that we start in, and then word that gives expression to the experience we're having of world, and how world is interacting with our soul and our spirit and our collective longing for wisdom and insight, how world presents itself so that our traditions can speak to it. Let's start there and see where the journey takes us. So, geez, that's plenty for this morning already, huh? But let's get started today. I've lit a candle today to kind of orient myself. And I would invite you to do the same. It's kind of a nice ritual way of bringing your own soul to this space. So while you're present, I know that life can be hectic even on a Sunday morning. So simply the act of lighting a candle and letting it embody your own inner self or the collective soul that we share, however you imagine the candle kind of manifesting that energy, I would invite you to light one today, and I'll have mine lit as well. But I want to just get us centered today, not by using the candle, just let the candle kind of bring you to this space. But I'm going to invite you for a moment of silence in these hectic days to tend to something either in nature or in the space that you're in right now that is more impermanent, that's not so stable, and harness your kind of soul's energy in the relationship with that which is impermanent, and see what that feels like today. But what do I mean by that? So today, maybe the birds aren't quite out yet, but maybe as we sit together and you sit in your space, open up a window and listen for bird song, something that you can't hold on to, but is present as gift for you. I've opened up the window, so I'm going to let the rushing creek be the thing that connects to me, knowing that waters are flowing by this space. I can't hold on to that water. It will move on, but it's present in my life. So I want you to link today, just for a moment of silence, to something that has a little bit of impermanence to it. It's more fluid, and see what that feels like today. So we're not grounding ourselves in that which is always so stable, especially in a time of change, but we feel what it's like to connect or be grounded in that which has a little impermanence. Okay? Hopefully you understand that. I can't get a lot of feedback from you, but I think you will. So take a couple deep breaths and just pause for a moment. Let's honor all that's going on in our lives and our souls, and just be present in silence collectively to something that is a wondrous but almost slippery gift of grace that dances around us each and every day. I invite you into a moment of quiet. And a few more calming breaths as we settle into this space. And then a sense of delight, or maybe even solidarity, with that you cannot ever control, but is ever present in your life. Maybe inviting you into a different kind of relationship to mystery or wonder, beauty, fluidity, change, impermanence, that which we cannot cling to. And then when you're ready, I invite you to kind of open your eyes again and let me close out this section with a little gift of poetry from one of my great Zen friends. This is a Zen poet from long ago, and I've brought my little Buddha today to kind of be chilling out with us as well. This is One Robe, One Bowl. It's the Zen poetry of Ryokan. And this one's a beautiful one. And it kind of, I think, given what we're going to talk about today, it is just a bookend to sort of how do we situate ourselves so that we're able to absorb a world that is in flux or changing. Here's the poem. My hut lies in the middle of a dense forest, and every year the green ivy grows longer. No news of the affairs of men, only the occasional song of a woodcutter. And as the sun shines, I mend my robe, and when the moon comes out, I read my poetry. I have nothing to report, my friends. For if you want to find the meaning, stop chasing after so many things. If you want to find the meaning, then stop chasing after so many things. Isn't that a beautiful piece of poetry? I might type that up for you because if you read it a couple times, it gets deeper and richer with every reading. Especially that sense that my hut, this metaphor, my hut is in the middle of a deep forest. Anyway, it's a great piece of poetry. I hope it brought some calm to you this morning. So welcome. Glad you're here. Today I want to spend a little bit of time just in a thought piece about systemic racism. Clearly, we have all been awakened, particularly those of us who've been able to ignore issues like systemic racism, who have not had to have movements like the Black Lives Matter movement as a part of our everyday nomenclature or experience, because we have a place of privilege in our society that softens our life to the point where it's just not, we don't have to get involved if we don't want to. And yet, it seems like we've hit this point, right? This point when we are called to dive in to a deeper understanding of both systemic racism, what we know now to be historic and sustained levels of racism that have really been a part of the fabric, part of our social fabric, that have caused so much pain and dis-ease for so many for so long, and then how that is raised to the surface now with both the impact of the pandemic, mostly on Black and brown lives predominantly because of the situation that has not provided them the same kind of means that other groups have, right? So we know that to be true. And then, of course, with more and more the police brutality that we've seen that's come to the surface, with the death of George Floyd, with his murder, and yet another one in Atlanta, the country is just raging with a need to be more aware of this subject. And so I just wanted to spend a little bit of time around that today. I personally don't think we're really that good at thinking systemically. You and I we grow up to think about, our own self-interest. We kind of start there. Maybe we have a sense of kind of a familial understanding of family systems. But if you study family systems, I'm not even sure we're really that aware of the impact of family systems in our lives. We don't really have this capacity to experience and express and be aware of the systems in which we operate. But we try, we move into community life and we try to understand how the commons are organized. We try to understand economic systems, global systems, even the ecosystem, right, that sustains us. But we're not that great at thinking systemically. And so this awakening that many of us are trying to dive into more fully is gonna take some work, and it's gonna take some exploration of language that we're not used to, and we're gonna stumble and make mistakes. It's gonna take some courage to have conversations with one another so we can understand and then react appropriately. I'll never forget when I went to seminary years ago. They knew this was the case as well. And many people who go to seminary who start off coming out of local congregations where they have fostered their own personal spiritual journey in the piety of a local congregation arrive at seminary, and they don't understand sort of the whole religious system. They have come motivated by their own personal faith that's been grounded in a small understanding of the religious experience that is very personal. And they come thinking they want to make a career out of serving others or bringing others into this experience. I did the same thing. Seminary then takes all these people, and I think I've got these books. And in year 2, they put you through what they call systematic theology. It's these 2 volumes, a couple of big walking books. It's a hard reading, right? Systematic theology is trying to help theological students who come to seminary exit the small world of their personal piety and enter into the larger system of the way in which theology and religious history works. And they begin to see that the stories of Jesus or the Hebrew people are rooted not in some sort of divine revelation, but they're birthed out of cultural contexts. And you have to bring a kind of a critical thinking to the way in which you look at a text, that it's not just a devotional piece, but it's grounded in place, time, history, culture, language, and that all has an effect on that text. And all those texts are then linked together in this huge system, this theological system that you have to understand and think critically about in order to begin the journey of being a clergy person. And so it's no surprise that by about year 2 in seminary, the dropout rate is close to 20 to 25%, because people feel like they have to let go of their personal piety, and that's so uncomfortable, and they have to embrace a sort of larger critical thinking about the way in which faith works, that it just sterilizes the whole thing. And I remember at seminary feeling so sorry for people who had to kind of fall by the wayside because this is not what they expected, right? There was a requirement for a certain kind of letting go, and almost an exodus from one way of thinking about your faith, and a need to kind of transition to a new language set and a new paradigm in which you could begin to journey forward. Hopefully you can see that's exactly what's going on as we think about systemic racism as well, right? It's going to require certain aspects of letting go of things, certain acts, kind of this call to exit or exodus from certain ways of being together collectively, so that we can enter into the unknown and construct new ways of being together. That's the challenge of when you start thinking systemically. It oftentimes is an affront or a confrontation to deeply held values that you had, but that were based on a smaller perspective, right? A perspective that didn't include all the dynamism to relationships and their effects on people, whether it be positive or negative. Yeah, I know it's a wonkish morning, but that's the way it's going to be today. All right, just go along for the ride. I'll give you another example. I don't think we're so good about thinking systemically if you think about the ecosystem. I mean, the ecosystem is probably the healthiest system, right? It's this myriad of species and interrelationships. It's trees and plants and animals and microbes and bodies and earth and air and water. You know, you think about the complexity of the ecosystem, and how it all has to collaborate together to sustain life. And if you look at the history of our species, we have not fared so well in both understanding it and constructing a life within that ecosystem that is mutually beneficial to both the system that supports us and our own personal lives. We're just not that good at it. I mean, look at what's going on in the environmental world, and you can tell we've not paid that much attention to the way in which the system works. And if we understand the system better, which is what the environmental movement has been all about, if we understand that system better, the hope is that we begin to change behaviors in a way that create different models of living in relationship to the ecological world that are more mutually beneficial to all the players within that system. That, to me, is what, when we think about systemic racism, what the challenge really is. It's expanding our awareness of the impact of these social systems and these economic systems and this educational system in a way that begins to integrate the experience of others that we don't necessarily have ourselves personally, and then to make the hard choices of how to move forward. So that to me is what's partially what's going on here. And I think we've kind of hit this tipping point. Like somebody, it's like a house of cards, the cultural milieu in which we live is this house of cards, and somebody grabbed the police brutality card and whooped it out of the house of cards, and the whole thing starts crumbling down. And all of a sudden we realize, oh my gosh, this is not just about police brutality. It's about economics. It's about the history of redlining and not having access to long-term capital investments on the part of Black people. It's about educational policies. It's about one thing after another, and we begin to grow our awareness to the point where our mind's about ready to explode, because this is a very complex system that, frankly, because I live in a place of privilege in that system, I think everything was just working just fine. That's the challenge we're in. So where do we go from here? Where do we go as we start to begin to, especially as white people, as we begin to say, hold on a minute, I don't know that I really understood what was going on. I'm like in my second year of seminary, and I'm hitting these Christian dogmatic books, this systematic theology, and I'm having to reframe the way in which I imagine our lives together as a culture, as a people, and how am I going to live into that? He said, welcome to my world. Your world too. So where do we go? Well, I thought it'd be kind of fun to go way back to the Hebrew story. I want you to think about for a minute Moses. You remember Moses, right? That's an old story. I don't even know where it is in the Bible, but if you go to Exodus, it's the second book of the Bible, you can read sort of this storyline. Moses, he's born as a Hebrew. The Hebrews were slaves in Egypt. And his mother decided to kind of give him up to the river and put him in a basket of reeds as a newborn in a river. And he's found by the people who have been privileged by the society. He's found by the Egyptians. So Moses, who is a Hebrew, part of the Hebrew slavery movement in Egypt, that's building all the pyramids, making bricks, blah, blah, blah. They are the people who are not faring well in that system, right? So Moses grows up in a place of privilege. In that place of privilege, he begins to witness the abuse of his own people. He knows he's a Hebrew. He begins to see how the people who have power are abusing his own kind. And he's so angered by that as he wakens up to that, right? He ends up killing an Egyptian who holds power. He kills somebody and has to flee for his life. And so he exits Egypt and runs away from it all. That's Moses. He gets privilege, and he gets all of those who have been living at the margins of a society because they're by the Egyptian structure of the time. Once he departs, right? That's the old, I think it's a burning bush thing, right? He runs in. God basically tells him. I mean, in the story, God tells him. God doesn't really do this, but there's some sort of awakening that happens for Moses, and Moses realizes that he's got to go back, and he's got to find the right words and the right kind of energy to confront the pharaohs, the leaders of the day. He's got to get his people's plight in front of the people in power. And so Moses is told, get your act together, Moses. Find your voice, and go back to Egypt and wake up Egypt to what's going on. Systemic racism, right? Wake them up, and maybe they'll let your people go free, or they'll invite your people into the society. Moses, he can't seem to figure out his mojo, so he's got to grab his brother Aaron, who is much better at public speaking apparently, and says, Aaron, come with me. We got to go in front and confront the Pharaoh. This is our Hebrew story, right? This is religion. It's great stuff. They go back to Egypt and they start battling the Pharaoh. And Pharaoh just says, no, we're not budging, right? In fact, he says, because you're misbehaving, I'm going to tell your people now they're going to make bricks, but I'm not going to give them any straw. So, I mean, it's just a horrible situation. And so come these plagues. Plagues, you say? Yeah, plagues. Plagues. It's almost like nature itself is saying, you can't set up systems like this without consequences. And so one plague after another comes rolling down the pike, right? To the point where finally the Pharaoh says, all right, I'm gonna let your people go. It's interesting that before the people leave, this is the last of the plagues, they have to paint lamb's blood on their doorposts. And I've always thought that's a weird thing to do, but I think what it is that it's this sign that I'm pouring my life into the possibility of a new future. It's like the community beginning to awaken to the point where saying, look, I know this isn't going to be easy, but I'm all in on this thing. And so they're ready in that moment. They're ready in that moment when Moses says, it's time to go. And it's not like they go into the solution. They go into the wilderness to figure out a new way of being a people together. And that story is so ripe with metaphors for where you and I are right now, where we are collectively, that I think we can kind of hold on to the inspiration of the Exodus story when we are anxious or nervous or scared or frustrated or can't find the right words. That story can be an inspiration for us to say we can be ready to move into an unknown future so that we might rewrite our collective human story together. In some ways, it's the only way I can sleep at night, with that level of hope and expectation. So what can we learn? A couple of things I think we can learn. Well, let me just say first, before I say a couple of things we can learn. How am I doing on time? I'm doing fine. One is that this is the way religious systems work in general, right? So the Hebrew people, it is out from a culture that's no longer sustaining the needs and hopes and longings of all of its people, that a new religious system is born. And that's the way it is with religions. Religions are always responding, like we started this discussion, always responding to world and then finding language to reframe world. The same is true in Islam. The same is true in Confucianism, in Buddhism, in Taoism, the Protestant Reformation. It's all about experiencing context and then seeking a greater, what would you call it, like almost like inspirational language that can hold us all so that we can journey in ways that are more whole and peaceful and equitable. And that's the life they were trying to form in the wilderness. That's the life they were trying to form as the prophet wrote the Quran. That is the life that the poet tries to construct in the Zen context. That's what religions do. So we're religious people. We should be doing this. That was a little bit of a side note, but that's why, in some senses, we have to be willing to say, look, are we willing to put skin in this game? Are we willing to put blood on our doorposts so that when the time comes, we know there's no option left of locking ourselves behind closed doors, but we've got to journey. So how do we get ready to journey? So 3 little learnings, I think, that I've had, and I'd be curious if you've got a chance to post up some of your thoughts too. Do it during this discussion, and we can all kind of go back and look what you thought. But here's 3 from me. Number 1, this one my wife taught me, and that is, it's like having courageous conversations, right? We're not going to be comfortable starting this conversation because I feel like I'm a 3rd grader heading into a conversation that's very complex. So you got to have conversations with one another that are kind of courageous, right? That kind of put you out on a limb a little bit. You're going to make mistakes. I'm going to make mistakes. I'm going to step on people's toes. I'm going to offend myself with words and ideas that I'm wrestling with. But you got to have those courageous conversations. And to have them, some of the key voices that you need to include as conversation partners are people of color. Listening. I've been very impressed, like Netflix and Amazon, I'm streaming that all the time, are trying to provide more movies and conversations. I think my Facebook feed is filled with insightful people of color who are bringing language and insight to this challenge so I understand it more fully. Listen, and then one to another, try to have some conversations that begin to open up the doorway for you a little bit more. So I think that's number 1. And don't trust you're going to figure it all out. I wasn't going to figure it all out this morning. So don't trust you can figure it all out. But that's a place to start. Okay? That's number 1. It's almost like Moses with God at the burning bush. I think it was the burning bush. I'm going to have to look that up. Saying, look, you got to find some words to engage Pharaoh so that you can start this journey. It's the same thing, right? So Moses, get to work, find some language. Number 2, how do we get the voice of Moses and Aaron in front of Pharaoh? We need to be supportive as ever of making sure the voices of Moses and Aaron, those who are clear about languaging all that we have to face around systemic racism, are getting their voices heard in the places of power. I think it's one of the great reasons why the protests are so important, why all the signage is so important. And yes, there's residual violence around the edges, but that mass voice of wisdom, of collective prophecy, has to be constantly out there, and we need to be supportive of it. I rode to work today, and along the bike path in Lafayette are people writing chalk signs, right? Black Lives Matter and all sorts of great little phrases to kind of capture the situation we're in on the path in Lafayette. That's a good sign, right? Let's find ways to keep this voice in front of ourselves and in places of power. I think that's number 2. And the last one, and this is a trickier one, is I think all of us have to be kind of ready to move. Right? When Moses said, look, there's going to come a day when we're going to have to exodus, when we're going to be called upon to let go of some things and then move into spaces we're not quite sure of. You think about the whole controversy around defunding police departments. We're not going to get all the language right. So we're going to wander into places that we don't quite understand together. But we're going to begin to construct new ways of thinking and being as a people. And I would hope that we can kind of get ready to go through the door, like be ready to put some skin in the game, get our blood on the doorpost, right? To say, I'm going to put my blood, sweat, and tears into this project for the sake of my kids and my grandkids and future generations. And for all those who've suffered for so long, I'm putting some skin in this game. Be ready to move through the door. And you know the story. As they move through the door, then they have to journey through the Red Sea, the parting of the waters, the leaving behind, the chase of those in power to close this movement down, washed out in the raging waters, so that the Hebrew people can journey into finding a new way of life together. Whew, boy, it's a great story. Let that story be inspiration to you if you are a person of faith, or you enjoy the rich traditions of kind of the ancient stories that hold wisdom to us. Let those stories give you some way to orient during these times. Okay? All right. Let me close by saying, while we've had a lot of practice ignoring this is going to be some heavy lifting. So I'm hoping to find some ways down the road a piece to just encourage conversation together. But I do like, and I'm seeing this, I like that you're posting up some ideas and reflections as well. Because I think that's totally important. Because even though we can ignore this as people of privilege, I don't really think that's going to be an option anymore. You really won't be able to stay behind closed doors. To do so feels a little bit like that Egyptian story, like death. Death. Rather, you got to be ready to move into the fluidity of that which is a little bit impermanent right now, right? That which is a little bit unknown. And that's why the ritual at the front end. To know that you can not only trust yourself like we often do to that which we think is absolute or stable or solid ground, but you can trust yourself to the flowing of the river, to the growing of the moss on the trees, to the chirping of the bird, to the wrestling of the squirrel, to the movement of the energy of the world that's constantly inviting us into an open tomorrow. You can trust yourself to that as well. To link the two together a little bit. Maybe the wisdom from your tradition and the wonder of the unknown blending together, dancing. What can it create? That's what I would hope for you. I want to close this time with this piece of poetry. I love this thing. I keep it in my office. I mean, if once things open up again, you can come back here and read this. But I want to end with this piece today, and this is a poem written by Jacqueline Suskin. She's not famous, but she started out her career as a poet who would sit with a typewriter at farmers markets. And to me, it was much like the theology I was talking about at the beginning, world and then word. She would sit at a farmer's market and have someone tell her their story. And then on a piece of paper that big, she would type a piece of poetry for them. When I heard about her, I got all excited. And one season, I called her up and I said, we're a church, we're a congregation, and I kind of described what we're going through, and I'd say, I'd love for you to write a blessing for us. And she typed this one up and sent it. And as you try to wrap your soul around all that's going on, I think it's a beautiful piece to send you with today. It's called Blessing, and it was typed up in 2015. And I hope it's a blessing for you today. It goes like this. Fortunate favor, allow us another day. Let us bow in awe at each gift of breath, at ache and pain, at all returning us to light again. Sweet and steady cycle, hurt and hold us. offer up all possibility to explain that experience is not without the low down depths of darkness. It is a wave of wonder that moves us through it all, that permits us our survival. It is a wave of wonder that moves us through it all, that permits us our survival. So, fortunate favor, allow us another day, and may we bow in awe at such a great gift. Amen. All right, my friends, as always, thank you for letting me hang out in your space and being able to drag out all my dirty laundry and kind of say, here's what I'm thinking about, how are you doing, means a lot to me. So a couple of announcements before we send you into the day. Number one, we know now that this digital format that we're in, even though we're working on making it better, is probably going to be with us for the long haul. Maybe even parallel to physical meetings, but I know we're going to be doing something like this for a while. So some good news, we are exploring an additional Taizé service that we might offer that's more contemplative, allows you to sit at home and maybe chant in concert with those singing. So that's in the works. And then also in about 2 weeks, I'm going to launch, rather than this sort of esoteric reflection time, more of a kind of a Bible reflection piece. So we're going to use the Gospel of Mark and just take it a little section at a time and then give you a little bit of reflection time and then get some feedback on that. And we'll do that via Zoom so that you can interact with that. So that's going to be coming up. Watch for that. Just a reminder, this week we do have our council meeting on Thursday, getting ready for the year end. So that'll be a final one that they have together in June. As in July, we welcome our new leaders to guide us. And then just a heads up, I'm off for vacation for a couple of weeks here, but I will be here each Sunday. I don't know where I'll be, maybe here, maybe at home, maybe off traveling somewhere, but I'll find an internet connection and keep guiding us along the way as we move forward. And then finally, Martin has a beautiful piece of music. I think it's We Shall Overcome. A great question. Shall we overcome? Shall we get our way through this? How do we get ready to move our way through this? Let that old spiritual link you not only to your tradition, but give you the courage to open up the door and be ready to move. Exodus, Moses, Aaron, finding our voice, being willing to risk the unknown a bit, trusting that life is calling us in new ways. Whew, it's quite a journey. Be well.